Hello, everybody, and welcome to another edition of Charts with Dan, back on the regular day and time for 1 week. I'm going to be back on the road next week, so I'm not quite sure when the show is going to be up, but rest assured, there will be a Charts with Dan episode next week, but let's not worry about that just yet. Let's talk about this weekend at the box office, which saw The Nun 2 dominating the box office charts, and also one of the best ever openings for a film from India. So we have a lot of different stories to get to. Before we do, just a quick reminder that 5% of the advertising revenue for the entire channel will be going to two different organizations for the duration of the writers and actors strikes, which are still unfortunately going on. Those two organizations are the Entertainment Community Fund and the Go for PAs Alliance. You can find links to both of those down in the description below. And you just watching this show helps to put money in the pockets of those organizations. So thank you very much. Let's look at the box office now for this past weekend. And the number one movie is The Nun 2, which had a solid debut at $32.6 million, about where most people had it tracked. The Equalizer 3 didn't have a fantastic second weekend. It dropped 65.3%. That's pretty steep for this time of year and for a movie like that, at just over $12 million in weekend 2 for a $61.7 million total. My Big Fat Greek Wedding 3 didn't really have big fat box office. This appears to be a franchise on the decline. A $10 million debut, well behind the previous two entries in the franchise. Well, I guess not quite behind the first one since it started off so slowly, but you know what I'm saying. In fourth place was the movie I referenced, Jawan. It made $6.1 million over the 3-day weekend. It's made $7.4 million overall since it was released last week domestically. Jawan is not just a big money earner here in the domestic marketplace, it is also a massive worldwide box office earner. It's shattered all kinds of records for films from India, for Hindi language films. It's already the 18th highest grossing film in Indian movie industry history. So there's a lot to go over, and we'll look at in just a few minutes how it did as far as debuts here domestically on the box office charts. But Jawan, which we will talk about a couple of other times beyond that on the show as well, really a massive weekend worldwide for that film. In fifth place was Barbie, which dropped 44.2% in its 8th week for a $5.7 million total. Just over $620 million domestically now for Barbie. Blue Beetle is in 6th place. It drops 46.3% for a $3.8 million total. $63.7 million domestic overall. Gran Turismo is in 7th place, a 47% drop and a $3.5 million total. It now has over $35 million domestically. Oppenheimer still hanging around the top 10, a 46.5% drop, a weekend total of just over $3 million, and a domestic total at about $315.2 million. Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles Mutant Mayhem is in 9th place with a 40.5% drop from last week, a $2.7 million weekend total, and a domestic total at over $111 million. And Bottoms, which did have a big expansion last week, had another expansion into wide release over 1,000 theaters, but it dropped 32.9% despite the addition of more theaters, a weekend total of just over $2 million. I think that may indicate that Bottoms has kind of hit the ceiling as far as expanding its box office reach, and we'll see how many of those theaters it holds on to next weekend. 3 movies dropping out of the top 10 this weekend. One of them is Talk to Me, which stayed in the top 10 for 6 weeks, and that is longer than some of the big summer releases that came out, like Fast X, The Flash, and Haunted Mansion. Talk to Me had some really good staying power. Meg 2, The Trench, also dropping out of the top 10 after 5 weeks, and Strays out of the top 10 after 3 weeks. When we look at the movies that lost the most theaters this past weekend, you may be surprised to see Elemental at the top. It lost 1,445 theaters, but that's because Disney put it in about 1,900 more screens last weekend as sort of a one last push thing before it went on Disney+. So really, this is dropping it back down to where it was more or less before last weekend. It's still in about 700 theaters. I think it'll probably lose the bulk of those theaters this weekend, but still, it's not like Elemental was still in 2,000 theaters until this past weekend. It's just contracting back from that expansion that Disney did last weekend. Losing 1,407 theaters is Liam Neeson's latest film, Retribution. It only had about a 2-week leash as far as the box office goes. It's now in only 320 theaters nationwide. Gran Turismo sheds 1,091 theaters. It's now in 2,765 theaters nationwide. Speaking of shedding, Strays stays at the number 4 spot here. It loses another 986 theaters. It's now in 1,500 theaters around the country. And Meg 2: The Trench gets rid of 797 theaters, with 1,574 theaters still playing the film. This is what I like to call the road to recovery, comparing the weekend box office total from the averages of 2021 and 2022, that's the red line, and then 2015 through 2019, which is the blue line, the pre-pandemic line, and we continue to kind of chart our course right in the middle of these two lines. We see an uptick there in the red line because Labor Day weekend actually fell on the 36th weekend of the year when Shang-Chi and the Legend of the Ten Rings came out, so that's why it spikes even though we did Labor Day last weekend here in 2023. And then the big spike on that blue line is due to really the It franchise. The highest grossing film for the 5 years preceding the pandemic was the first It movie. The second It movie also came out the same weekend, which is why it spikes there not just 1 year, but in multiple years. So this is really the kickoff of the fall movie season. We're not quite there. We had a couple of big titles that are now gone, and it is really kind of upsetting that the strikes are now pushing so many things back because we really do have some momentum. I think even when you look at the performance of movies like The Equalizer 3 and The Nun 2, they're not blockbuster performances, but they show to me that people seem to be getting back in the habit of going to see movies in theaters, and yet now we are pulling movies out of theaters. It's just, it is maddening beyond even a box office level. To me, as a fan of movies, it is just absolutely maddening. Closing this week, believe it or not, this movie has been open the whole time after 23 weeks in domestic release. The Super Mario Bros. Movie is ending its domestic run after a $574.9 million domestic gross, a $785 million international gross, and a worldwide gross of over $1.3 billion. You see my estimated theatrical profit there for the Super Mario Bros. Movie is at over $400 million. How did I get that number? Well, let's take a look. 22.5% of the Chinese box office is about $5.6 million. 40% of the international box office is about $300 million. And then we have the different cuts week by week for the domestic release. This was not a very expensive movie. $100 million budget. I'm giving it $100 million in marketing. So that would be a $200 million cost. The movie grossed $1.36 billion worldwide. I estimate from that it netted $629.1 million. You subtract that $200 million cost, that gets you a theatrical profit of $429.1 million before you bring in anything like merchandising or VOD, home video sales, all of that kind of stuff. I say home video, you know what I mean, physical media sales. That isn't even counted yet. This is money that's going back to Universal. This is money that is going back to Nintendo, and it's a lot of money going back to both of those companies. So it is a very safe bet that we're going to be seeing a lot more Mario and probably a lot more Nintendo in the near future. Let's look at the top 5 films outside of the domestic marketplace internationally, and Jawan takes the crown if you discount the domestic box office at $56.5 million. As I said, this was a very successful and very popular movie around the world, driven by the popularity of Shah Rukh Khan, also known as SRK, the star of the film, also the star of Pathaan. So a really, really good year for him, and really a good year for the Indian box office, for the Indian film industry, not just inside of India, but outside of India. The Nun 2 comes in second place at $52.7 million internationally, followed by the Chinese film Dust to Dust with $21.9 million, Oppenheimer with $19.4 million, and The Equalizer 3 with $11.5 million. When you take those international grosses, you combine them with our domestic grosses, we get our top 5 films worldwide, and due to its strong opening domestically, The Nun 2 takes the number 1 slot worldwide at $85.3 million all told. Jawan is in second place at $62.6 million, followed by The Equalizer 3, which dropped 61.3% from last weekend at $23.5 million. Oppenheimer drops 59.4% from last weekend at $22.6 million, and Dust to Dust rounds out the top 5 at $21.9 million. That's a very close race for 3, 4, and 5 there. So let's talk a little bit about The Nun 2 and the Conjuring franchise in general. It has been one of the most reliable and consistent franchises inside and outside of the horror genre in the last 10 years. So let's take a look at where The Nun 2 falls in the history of the Conjuring franchise. And when we look at the opening weekends, out of the 9 Conjuring films, and I do count The Curse of La Llorona because it did tie itself, even very loosely, it is still a tie to the Conjuring universe. The Nun is in 6th place at $32.6 million, ahead of The Curse of La Llorona, The Conjuring, The Devil Made Me Do It, and Annabelle Comes Home. Annabelle Creation is the 5th best opening film in the franchise. Then Annabelle at number 4, The Conjuring 2 at number 3, The Conjuring at number 2, and then the first Nun movie had the best opening in franchise history at $53.8 million about 5 years ago. I remember when that movie opened as well as it did, which is very frustrating because I don't like that movie very much. When you adjust for inflation, nothing actually really changes on this chart. The numbers just go up. The Nun's opening is at about $65.5 million adjusted for inflation. The Conjuring is at about $54.9 million, with The Conjuring 2 at $51.4 million, Annabelle at $47.9 million, and Annabelle Creation at $43.6 million. So really just an uptick as far as the numbers go there. When we look at the franchise tracker as far as total domestic box office, the first Conjuring film is the domestic box office champ at $137.4 million, followed by The Nun at $117.4 million, then The Conjuring 2 at $102.4 million, and Annabelle Creation at just over $102 million. So we have 4 out of 9 Conjuring films, all over $100 million. In 5th place is Annabelle, followed by Annabelle Comes Home, The Conjuring, The Devil Made Me Do It, and The Curse of La Llorona. Right now, The Nun 2 is about $22 million behind La Llorona. We'll see if it has a big drop-off in weekend 2. Horror films generally do. It had about a C+ cinema score, which is about what you would expect for most horror films. They don't usually score very high on the cinema score, but will we see that 65 to 70% weekend 2 horror movie drop like we've seen so many times before? We're just going to have to wait and see. Adjusting for inflation, really, again, nothing changes. The Conjuring has made $180.2 million adjusted for inflation, followed by The Nun at $142.9 million. Really, the biggest change is that inflation puts Annabelle also over the $100 million mark back from 2014. It's at $108.8 million. And then looking at the franchise as far as worldwide box office, and The Nun actually has the worldwide crown for the Conjuring franchise at $363.3 million. The Conjuring is in 2nd place at $316.8 million, and The Conjuring 2 at $310.1 million. See how consistent those grosses are? Annabelle Creation's in 4th place at $305.3 million. Annabelle is at $256.8 million, followed by Annabelle Comes Home, The Conjuring, The Devil Made Me Do It, and The Curse of La Llorona, which made $123.1 million. Even the low movie on this list prior to The Nun 2's release was still at over $125 million worldwide, which again is 4, 5, 6 times the movie's production budget. And this is really how the horror genre has worked for so long, is you put out a movie that doesn't cost that much to make, and yet it returns a lot on that investment. And in that vein, I wanted to look into just which franchises are the best return on investment by percentage, not by raw dollars, but just by percentage. So I went and I found the franchises that had 9 or more entries. This is the 9th entry in the Conjuring franchise. And for those franchises that had traceable budget data and box office data, I calculated which franchises had the best return on their budgets by percentage. And as I'm sure you're probably not surprised to hear, horror does dominate the top of this list, but the top returning franchise by percentage is not The Conjuring, it's actually Saw. Saw has brought in over 10.76 times the budget for all of its movies combined across the combined franchise. The Conjuring has brought in 10 times the combined budget of all the movies, and then Halloween is in 3rd place at 6.4 times its budget as far as worldwide box office gross. Rocky's brought in 6.36 times the budget of its movies. followed by Star Wars at 5.94 times the budget, and then Friday the 13th at 5.93 times the budgets of all the movies. The Wizarding World has returned 5.52 times the film's combined budgets, followed by the Spider-Man films at 4.99 times. That would be the Sam Raimi trilogy, the Andrew Garfield films, the Tom Holland films, as well as the Spider-Verse movies. The MCU has returned 4.6 times the budget of its movies, and that's a lot when you consider how huge the budgets are. It's well over $20 billion of worldwide box office grosses. Nightmare on Elm Street thus far has brought in 4.4 times the budgets of its movies, followed by James Bond at 4.27 times the budget. The Batman films at 4.22 times the budget, Fast and Furious at 4.19 times the budget, and then these are kind of the dicier investments. The X-Men movies have brought in 3.42 times the budgets of all the movies combined. Medea brings in about 3 times its budgets, but that's fine because Medea budgets are usually pretty low. Then we have the DCEU, which has only brought in 2.72 times the combined budgets of all of its projects, which, we talk about this on the show all the time. When you're only bringing in 2.7 times your production budget, especially on big movies like the DCEU, that means that you are likely either barely breaking even or losing money. And that's just kind of an underlined example of how disappointing the box office returns have been for the DCEU, largely dragged down by the last 3 or 4 years. However, the worst investment as far as percentage of budget returned hits near and dear to my heart because it's Star Trek. The Star Trek franchise total has only brought in 2.5 times its combined production budgets, which again can be tough to turn a profit. I get it. Star Trek is a tough sell. There have been individual big hit movies inside the franchise, but often they are scrambling just to break even. So when you look at those numbers, it's pretty clear why so many horror movies keep coming out and why they may not necessarily always be the best. It's because they are made so cheaply that the clearance to make a lot of money on them isn't really that high. If you can make a movie for $20 million, marketed it for $30 million, and make $200 million worldwide, well, great. You just go on to make another one. It was surprising to me where some of the blockbuster franchises landed on that list, but it was not surprising that horror dominated the top of it. If you're going to invest in a horror movie, if you're a producer, you really can't get much safer as far as your investment goes than a low budget horror film, because it's very likely that you're not only going to make your money back, but you're going to make it back and then some. We've got a lot more to get to, but before we do, I want to thank the sponsors for this week's show. This episode is brought to you by Stamps.com. I know it's crazy to think about, but the time to start planning for the holidays is here. And if you're running a business, that means you're probably sending more than you do all year. You're trying not to have that crazy year-end rush with all the stress, but more mail doesn't have to mean more stress. Stamps.com has been helping businesses like yours save time and money for 25 years, and it can help you get ready for the holiday ramp-up. Stamps.com is your own personal post office wherever you are because all you need is a computer and a printer. They even send you a free scale so you'll have everything you need to get started. I'm on the road a lot, and it's great knowing that if I have stuff to send out, I have a mobile post office ready to go anywhere I am. You can easily schedule pickups on your Stamps.com dashboard, and they've made things even easier with the Stamps.com mobile app. And if you sell products online, Stamps.com seamlessly connects with every major marketplace and shopping cart. Using Stamps.com, you can also get huge carrier discounts up to 84% off USPS and UPS rates to help your bottom line, and they'll help you find the cheapest and best shipping option for you. Get your business ready for the holiday rush. Get started with Stamps.com today. Sign up with promo code Murrell for a special offer that includes a 4-week trial plus free postage and a free digital scale. No long-term commitments or contracts. Just go to Stamps.com, click the microphone at the top of the page, and enter code Murrell. This episode is brought to you by Babbel. Everyone knows what you call someone who speaks 2 languages, right? Yeah, bilingual. But what about someone who only speaks 1 language? Well, by and large, you'd call that person an American, because only 22% of Americans speak a language other than English at home. But starting this fall, you can start learning a new language and be the exception, not the rule, because with Babbel, you can start speaking a new language in just 3 weeks. Why Babbel? Well, because it works. Babbel's quick 10-minute lessons are designed by over 150 50 language experts, and Babbel is designed by real people for real conversations. I've been brushing up on my Spanish, and getting back into the swing of things that I learned so many years ago is as easy as uno, dos. That's the sound you hear on Babbel when you get something right. With over 10 million subscriptions sold, Babbel is real language learning for real conversations, and their advanced speech recognition is like having your own personal language coach to help improve your pronunciation and get you prepped and confident for real-world conversations. Here's a special limited-time deal for our watchers and listeners to get you started right now. Get 55% off your Babbel subscription, but only for people watching the show at babbel.com/Dan. That's 55% off at babbel.com/Dan. That's spelled BABBEL.com/Dan. Rules and restrictions may apply. I mentioned that Jawan had a very strong opening. It's actually the fourth best opening ever for an Indian film domestically. Bahubali 2, The Conclusion from 2017, still holds the record at $10.4 million in its opening weekend, followed by RRR, which brought in $9.5 million in March of 2022. Then we had Pathaan from earlier this year, which brought in $6.8 million. Jawan is in fourth place. It did not open on Friday. It opened a few days earlier, so it's at $6.1 million. And then Brahmastra Part 1 Shiva is in fifth place at $4.5 million. But when you look at this, 4 of the 5 highest opening weekends ever for Indian films domestically have been within the last 2 years. So the Indian film industry is really starting to gain even more traction and even more of a foothold domestically than at any other time in Indian film history, and it's great to see. Let's take a look at how Barbie is performing as we look at other movies in the top 5. This is Barbie versus other top grossers of the decade. That black line going off of the chart is Spider-Man No Way Home, and we see Barbie as Avatar The Way of Water begins to pull away, and as Top Gun Maverick is very close to overtaking Barbie, we can kind of see where it looks like it's going to end up domestically behind Top Gun and also behind Avatar. The other thing that we have been looking at is the number 10 position of all time. What movie will be the 10th highest grossing film of all time domestically, Barbie or Jurassic World? This is how their two lines compare. Jurassic World still leading the way as it has literally since day one, but that gap continuing to close, although it looks a little bit more parallel this week than it did last week. I think it's going to be a very, very close competition to see if Barbie can take that number 10 domestic all-time spot away from Jurassic World. It did move up this list, however, the highest grossing Warner Brothers films of all time adjusted for inflation. Barbie has now moved past 1989's Batman to become the third highest grossing film of all time adjusted for inflation, behind The Dark Knight and The Exorcist. And I've actually had a few people ask why the Lord of the Rings films aren't on here. And it is a little hazy, but the reason I'm not including The Lord of the Rings as a Warner Brothers film is that New Line was purchased prior to the production of The Lord of the Rings by Time Warner, the company that also owned Warner Brothers, but the studios were run completely separately until 2008. That's when New Line and Warner Brothers were merged. So even though they had the same corporate parent, they were running as two individual studios. So I do not count the Lord of the Rings films as Warner Brothers movies because they happened pre-merger. Blue Beetle dropped out of the top 5 this past weekend, but it moved past The Suicide Squad to become the 11th highest grossing film all time in the DCEU, and barring some massive surge at the box office, that's where it's going to stay. So it will have outgrossed Wonder Woman 1984, Shazam! Fury of the Gods, and The Suicide Squad, which, I mean, 2 of those movies were available day and date on streaming, and one of them is, Shazam! Fury of the Gods. So as much as I wish that there was more positive news for Blue Beetle at the box office, there really isn't a whole lot. I guess it's not as big of a disaster as it could have been. I'm glad that there are so many people out there that saw it and liked it, and I hope that it continues to build a fan base, but it does not look to be having a box office comeback story as so many people wish that it would. Let's look now at the per theater averages for this past weekend. At number one is the film Americazzi, which made $18,861 per theater in 3 theaters. I highlighted this movie on my Coming Up show last week. It is a period piece about a man from America who returns to his Armenian roots but finds himself in a prison camp and then connects with the guard next door. He can see his house from his prison cell. It's apparently been well received, and it takes the highest per theater average of the weekend. The Nun 2 had the second highest per theater average at $8,746 per theater in 3,728 theaters. Not far behind, though, was Jawan, playing in 824 theaters, so almost 3,000 fewer theaters. It brought in $7,428 per theater. The art documentary Close to Vermeer, playing in 1 theater, is in 4th place at $6,444. And then in 5th place, also playing in 1 theater, is a 50th anniversary re-release of The Wicker Man, not the one with Nicolas Cage and the bees, but the one with Christopher Lee, bringing in $5,765 in that 1 theater. It's good enough for number 5 on this list. Here were the top films in limited release, so these are movies in 1,000 theaters or fewer. At number 1 is Jawan, playing in 824 theaters at $6.1 million. In second place on the list is Miss Shetty, Mr. Polischetti, in an unknown number of theaters. It brought in reportedly around $750,000. Another film from India, this one in the Telugu language. It's a rom-com. In third place is Golda, starring Helen Mirren, playing in 331 theaters at $291,926. Aristotle and Dante Discover the Secrets of the Universe, played in 525 theaters and brought in a total of $240,000. And then Cat Video Fest 2023, in its 6th week, brought in $64,150 in 87 theaters. I was reading a little bit about Cat Video Fest, which is literally just cat videos. And one of the unique things about it is it's not one of those things where, okay, it releases on this date and you have to show it on these days. From what I've heard, it is kind of up to individual theaters as far as when they want to show it and when they don't want to show it, which is why you see it pop up here on this chart 6 weeks in, because these theaters decided, okay, well, this is a good weekend for Cat Video Fest, and hey, it's packing them in. We actually have some changes here on the top 10 grossers in limited release this year. Pathan remains number 1 and Past Lives remains number 2, but Jawan enters the chart at number 3 with $7.4 million and looking to perhaps eclipse Pathan on this list. The re-release of Return of the Jedi falls to number 4. A Man Called Otto falls to number 5. Rocky Aur Rani is at number 6. Bottoms is at number 7. However, it will not advance to this list because it moved into wide release this weekend. So I basically freeze the gross when it breaks that 1,000 theater barrier. So that's going to be the top of its performance on this chart. Nefarious moves down 2 spots to number 8. Punny and Selvin moves down 2 spots to number 9. Women Talking moves down 2 spots to number 10. And You Hurt My Feelings and The Wandering Earth 2 both drop out of the top 10. Now, many of those movies and other independent films can be found in the independent theaters that are scattered around the country, and I wanted to highlight not just one theater, but 2 theaters this week. They're run by the same organization. I'm talking about the State Theater and the Bijou by the Bay Theater, both of them in Traverse City, Michigan, and operated by the Traverse City Film Festival organization. The State Theater dates back to 1916 when it was built as the Lyric. After burning down a couple of times and being renamed the State in 1949, the theater closed in 1996 but was protected from destruction while plans were made for its future. In 2007, the theater was donated to the Traverse City Film Festival and after extensive renovation, opened in November 2007 as a single-screen theater, and a very majestic looking one, I have to say. The Bijou by the Bay is a smaller theater just a block away from the State that was also transformed from an abandoned museum into a theater in 2013. The State is playing My Big Fat Greek Wedding 3 this week, while Barbie is still gracing the Bijou's single screen. Coming up next month, the State Theater will be sponsoring a special screening of the documentary After Parkland, which focuses on the families of those lost in 2018's Parkland school shooting. Both theaters are operated by the Traverse City Film Festival, which recently decided to stop holding its annual event. Their focus is now on running these 2 theaters, and the organization is a 501c3 nonprofit, which means that you can deduct any donations that you make. You can donate and buy tickets for both theaters at stateandbijou.org, and if you end up going or donating, be sure to tell them, as always, that Dan sent you. Well, the summer box office season is officially over, but that means it's time to introduce a new chart, what I like to call the fall holiday box office chart. This will take us through the end of the year, and right now we really only have 3 releases on the chart. I don't put every movie that comes out, just movies that make a substantial enough gross of $1 million or more at the box office. The Nun 2 right now, the number 1 movie at the fall holiday box office, followed by My Big Fat Greek Wedding 3 and Jawan at number 3. We will, of course, be filling in these lines as the weeks go on. Looking at the annual domestic box office, nothing changes from last week. Barbie, of course, still the number 1 movie of the year, followed by the Super Mario Brothers movie, Spider-Man Across the Spider-Verse, Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 3, and Oppenheimer. The Little Mermaid's at number 6, Ant-Man and the Wasp: Quantumania is at number 7, John Wick Chapter 4 is at number 8, Sound of Freedom's at number 9, and Indiana Jones and the Dial of Destiny is at number 10. Also, no changes on the 2023 worldwide box office. Barbie has now broken the $1.4 billion barrier. The Super Mario Brothers movie is at $1.36 billion. Oppenheimer is knocking at the door of $900 million worldwide. Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 3 is in 4th place. Fast X is in 5th place, followed by Spider-Man Across the Spider-Verse, Full River Red, The Wandering Earth 2, The Little Mermaid, and Mission Impossible: Dead Reckoning Part 1. Before we wrap up, as always, I want to take a look at a weekend in box office history, and we're going to go back to a time when there was also a My Big Fat Greek Wedding movie in the top 5. As a matter of fact, it's the first movie. We're going back to September 6th through the 8th, 2002. My Big Fat Greek Wedding was not the number 1 movie. It was famously never the number 1 movie. The number 1 movie was Swim Fan, which debuted with $11.3 million. It had a final domestic total of $28.5 million, and I believe this is the closest that My Big Fat Greek Wedding ever got to the number 1 spot in its 21st week of release, dropping just 6.6% from the previous week. It had made to that point $95.8 million. It still had another $150 million or so left in the box office tank. That movie really was an absolute phenomenon. City by the Sea, starring Robert De Niro and Frances McDormand, was in 3rd place. I have no functional memory of this movie. I don't think that Robert De Niro really had any favors done to him by this poster. He looks kind of like a mix between Jean Reno himself and Steven Seagal. $8.93 million for a final domestic total of $22.4 million. M. Night Shyamalan's Signs was still going strong in week 6, a 41.6% drop and a $7.8 million total, on its way to a final domestic of $227.9 million. And Vin Diesel as Triple X, still in the top 5, a 49.5% drop in week 5, a $5.2 million weekend, and on its way to a $142.1 million domestic total. Of course, we don't just like to leave those old numbers laying there. We like to adjust for inflation to see what they would look like if you were to put them into today's dollars. And when we hit that inflation button, we see that Swim Fan debuts to an adjusted total of $19.2 million, on its way to a $48.5 million adjusted domestic final. My Big Fat Greek Wedding's at $17.6 million, on the way to a final of $410 million adjusted for inflation. That movie was absolutely massive. City by the Sea at number 3 with an adjusted weekend of $15.1 million. Signs in 4th place with $13.3 million, with an adjusted domestic final total of $387.3 million. Also a massive hit for M. Night Shyamalan there. And Triple X, people forget how big that first movie was. $8.8 million in week 5 for an adjusted final domestic total of $241.4 million. So that franchise did exactly what you would expect it to do, which would be to get rid of the star in the next movie. And that does it for Charts with Dan. Stay tuned here this week. I'm not exactly sure what you're going to see because, as I mentioned, I've got a couple of travel things coming up. So who knows? I might be on the road. I might bank some stuff here. But whatever I end up doing, I appreciate you watching here on the channel. You can stay tuned because whether it's this week or next, I'll be back with more movie news, reviews, box office, and more. Until next time, stay safe. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you then. Bye.